This
is URN.
University
Radio.
Nottingham.
Hello, we are live on University Radio Nottingham. This is The Big Picture with Felix Hawes. Joining us today we have Jacob.
Hello.
Luke.
Hello.
And award-winning, but not in the radio, James.
Hello.
Good to see you. Thanks for coming on, James. This is James's first on the radio. So today we are talking about our new Prime Minister. Yes, we have. Seems like we've got a new Prime Minister every week. This one is Rishi Sunak. We will also be talking about Donald Trump being called to the January 6th committee and the arrest of Steve Bannon or the imprisonment, I should say. And we'll also be talking about the Brazilian elections, which I believe the second round is happening tomorrow. I'd like to remind our listeners that you can message in on the online platform of URN. There will be a box and we should hopefully see your questions, and I might mention them if I feel like it. Okay, so our first topic then is our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who won a sort of coronation as a victory because no one ran opposed to him. So I just want to talk about that brief leadership contest first. We were last time on last week's show talking about who we thought was going to make it through to get the 100 nominations, and we were thinking about Rishi Sunak, we were thinking about Boris Johnson, potentially Penny Mordaunt. Boris Johnson pulled out. He said that he did have the nominations, but didn't want to run because he would struggle to have struggle for the party to back him fully. There has been some doubt on whether or not he did have the nominations, though the 1922 committee have stated that he did get 110 nominations, which would have been enough. So, do you think Rishi Sunak was the best option, and do you think it was right that Boris Johnson pulled out from the contest?
Last week on the show, I said that Boris Johnson winning through the membership vote would be the nightmare scenario for the Conservative Party, and I think that has been borne out by the events of the last week. He clearly found that although he had enough nominations to stand, he did not have enough to rule the party and to maintain discipline in the parliamentary party if he was to win in a membership vote. So, I think barring a ridiculous outcome like the membership's vote choosing Boris, Sunak was the right choice, and indeed the one that the 1922 committee essentially engineered by aligning the rules in the way that they did.
Oh, we've got a message saying can't hear who's speaking. Can they get close to the mic? Sorry, that might be a mic problem rather than a problem with you, Luke. But that's someone's messaged that. Do message if things improve. Sorry, a good point though, Luke. By the way, James, do you agree with Luke's position on this?
Yeah, I think. I mean, like he said, the competition was basically engineered to make sure that Rishi won. I think they hoped that Boris would not have got 100 nominations. I think that was the point of them setting the bar so high, was to make sure that he wouldn't get enough nominations. Whether he did, he actually did. It became clear that he wouldn't have been able to do anything within the party. Penny Mordaunt, I think, is irrelevant, let's be honest here. I think she is a bit, she would not have had the ability to unite the party. And I think, for Rishi, I think it is very difficult as well to unite the party, very obviously. It's a very, very divided party. But I think he was sort of this is the last chance kind of thing for the Conservative government, Like you had the complete shambles that was Boris Johnson's government. You had to follow that up with Liz Truss, that was never supposed to happen because, again, all the Tory MPs wanted Rishi back then. This is sort of the last chance for, I think, a lot of the public, for a lot of the Tory MPs themselves, to be fair, whether they think, because there are Tory MPs saying that they think it's time, the party needs a stint in opposition to sort themselves out, this is the last opportunity kind of thing. So I think for the Conservative Party, it's the best outcome, and I think if it was between Rishi or Boris, I'm not a Tory, but I definitely prefer Rishi. He is a lot more, I don't know, he has an air of, like, capability to him, that Boris didn't have. He seems pretty reasonable, generally speaking, even though I don't agree with him politically. I can, get behind him and trust that he's a politician, not a bit of a clown, which is what Boris, I think, acted like a lot of the time.
Interesting point. Jakey, would you agree with that what James is saying, that Rishi Sunak was the best option because he was more of your standard politician? I mean, I saw James O'Brien from LBC tweeted that Rishi Sunak will be bad, but at least he'll be conventionally bad.
Yeah, I think anything that results in Boris not being Prime Minister is a possible outcome.
Oh, well, that's a fair point. I mean, it's important to note that in opinion polls, and opinion polls are just that, opinion polls, they're not an election, but it did show that Boris Johnson did actually have the best chance of beating the Labour Party under Keir Starmer out of Sunak, Boris, Truss and Mordaunt, but perhaps you're looking at someone from a bad bunch. I don't know. The British public seem to be turning against the Conservative Party. I just want to point out that someone called Gemma, who is award nominated for her radio show, is listening right now. So we've got the stars listening in today, and we also have our regular listeners, Amy and James and Lucy and Ollie are listening, and I've just said hello, and maybe George Scotland's aunt's listening as well. We'll see. Okay, well, James, you said that Rishi Sunak was more palatable, perhaps. I mean, I'm putting words into your mouth, but that's what I got the impression of.
What do you do?
Which is interesting, because Rishi Sunak actually polls quite well with Tory Remainers, those that were a bit put off by Boris Johnson. But do you think the appointment of Suella Braverman is likely to booster Sunak's support with the more liberal Conservatives of the South and South East specifically? Or do you think actually he's now going to annoy everybody because the people that a lot of Braverman's natural supporters are not big fans of Rishi Sunak? I'm talking about the GB News wing of the Conservative Party, and those that perhaps would actually think he's got his head screwed on might not think that appointing someone that was sacked by Liz Truss, of all people, 6 days before she was reappointed for leaking information to... Well, basically, the situation was that she used her personal email, which you're not allowed to do on government business, and emailed John Hayes, who is a Conservative backbencher, and someone who she thought was his wife, but was actually just a random parliamentary staffer, some important documents. And apparently she was previously under investigation by MI5 about leaking secrets. Do you think that was a wise move? And why do you think Suella Braverman, or Leaky Sue, as some are calling her, has been reappointed? Do you think it could be the fact that, as she's sort of seen as a leading figure on the party right, that Sunak was desperate to get Suella Braverman on his side so that she wouldn't back Boris Johnson, and therefore that he would win unopposed?
Well, yeah, I think it was a sort of, I hate to accuse it of like a backroom deal was struck.
You'd hate to, would you, James? I know you're normally very positive about the Conservative Party.
I'd hate to do it, but maybe that's what I'm implying right now. But, I do think that he was desperate to, because again, he had the numbers. Like, I think by the end of it, Rishi had like 200 almost MPs backing him. So it wasn't like he was worried about getting the right of the party on his side. He just wanted to make sure he had the right of the party not backing Boris, kind of thing. Because I think if Suella... Is it Braverman or Braverman? I actually don't know.
I think you can probably pronounce it either
I'll
way.
Go with Braverman. I think if Boris got Braverman backing him, and like with Suella Braverman sort of comes the whole ERG, a lot of the right of the party, I think Boris would have seen it as like potentially he could, lead the party kind of thing. Like he would have potentially had the support of enough of the party to govern, and therefore would have won the members' vote, and then we'd be talking about Prime Minister Johnson right now again. But so I do think it was a deal hatched that she get put back in her post, and then Rishi gets the support of the right of the party. I don't think it'll, to be honest, do much to help Rishi vote wise. It's the classic thing. You always want to appeal to the centre, and Braverman is clearly not on the centre. a lot of Tory MPs themselves are coming out and are like, I'm not too sure whether that was a good call, just because, you know, she has no credibility. She was sacked a week before being reappointed, you know.
For something quite serious, some could argue.
Yeah, for a serious matter. Like, it's serious leaking as any, like, minister, but especially in the Home Office where you have to deal with, like, MI5, MI6, you have to deal with, like, police and stuff like that. To be leaking stuff there with your own personal email, accidentally sending emails, like important documents, to the wrong people, like, there is no good way to package this. And some people are saying that Rishi should get rid of her. I don't think he can, to be honest, because I think if he does get rid of her, he loses the support of the right of the party. And then there's another faction. There's not only the Johnsonites who are against him, but there's also another group of about 50 MPs maybe who will be attempting to, you know, take the government down, put Boris or someone else more, like, from their wing on the helm. And I do think that if there's another competition, I think that the Tories will never come close to winning the next election. Like I said, I do think Rishi's the last chance, so he has to try and unite the party and has to do things that may not seem right, I would say.
Would you agree with that, Luke?
Yeah, I think the appointment of Braverman, or rather the reappointment of Braverman, is less about the leadership election and more about holding the party together over the next, I think it's 18 months until the next likely general election in January 2025. There's a very a significant challenge facing any Conservative leader at this point, and that's to hold together a party that has been tearing itself apart at the seams ever since the Brexit vote in 2016. And so although it's very clear, and the public and the press have made this very clear, that Braverman is not very competent and has been, as you say, leaking confidential documents and what have you, Sunak is in a way shackled to her and to the right of the party, because if they go into open revolt, what hope does he have? He would have no more authority than Truss at that point, because he only has ambivalent support from what you might call the left or the middle of the party, these Tory Remainers who are so badly treated by the Boris years, that he doesn't have much of a support base in the party as it is. And so if he starts making enemies with the very vocal ERG, I think that would severely dampen his chances of making it to the next general election.
Jacob, what do you think?
Yep, I think it is really just an attempt to kind of, as we said, to hold the party together. Whether the Conservative Party will actually be able to hold itself together remains to be seen. Obviously, Felix, you know my political opinions. You know that I would, along with some other people on this panel, maybe be not too sad if the Conservative Party tears itself apart and makes way for a Labour government. But yeah, we'll see what happens.
Yes, I mean, the Conservative Party have been quite divided, and it's interesting what you say, and the polling does show that Sunak is more popular with Remainers than Truss was, even though Sunak was a Brexiteer and Truss was a Remainer. So it's interesting how things can shift around. I mean, I do remember the days when Jacob Rees-Mogg said that Liz Truss was a bigger Brexiteer than he was, which I think is quite a difficult thing to manage. We've had some messages. Loving the show, Felix. You're doing a good job on your first show. James from the regulars in Beeston. That's a good message for you, James. You're doing a good job.
Damn right.
I would agree with that. Hi from Jenna. Loving the programme. Is that Jenna from my school, or is that a different Jenna? Let me know. Hi everyone from Jess and Dave in Cornwall. Good to have you back on, Jess. You had great questions last week. Also, so someone's also said it's also very funny to see that James Cleverly has been reappointed as Foreign Secretary. He's the same man who supported Boris and only 18 hours or so jumped boats. The same can be said for Nadeem Sahawi. Yes, of course, Nadeem Sahawi said it's time for Boris to come back. After he'd already called for Boris to resign when he was Chancellor for a brief period, although he was Chancellor for longer than Kwasi Kwarteng, and now he's back again. So it is very interesting. Now, we were talking about, James, you were making the point, Rishi Sunak being the last chance for the Conservative Party. The polls have moved in favour of the Conservative Party, but it's important to note they're still on average about 28 points behind, which is higher than they were. So there has been a little bit of a Sunak bounce, but they're miles behind the Labour Party, and at the moment it would still be a huge landslide victory for the Labour Party if the Labour Party won. although it is interesting to say that a recent poll did come out that said that Rishi Sunak is more of a preferred Prime Minister than Keir Starmer. So although that doesn't always matter about which leaders are preferred, it obviously does play a part in some elections. For example, Corbyn and Johnson, with Johnson being a lot more popular than Corbyn. But they are pretty neck and neck, and obviously the polls on the parties don't seem to reflect that. Do you think that the Conservative Party are going to lose the next election regardless really of what anything Rishi Sunak does? Or do you think there is a chance that the Conservative Party might be able to just pass the post from the first past the post election? Or do you think, what do you think the Conservative stances are? Do you think they're going to be wiped out? Do you think they might manage to make a slim majority? Will they get another landslide? Do you think the Labour Party are going to slightly get a majority? Or where do you think it's going to go? Do you think Sunak can turn things around?
I think potentially is what I think. I think the problem is, like you said, like they were polling like 30 points behind under Truss, and polling like that leaves a mark. You know, that's gonna scar, that's gonna stick around, kind of thing. You don't poll 30 points behind for a month and then just recover, you know, another month later, kind of thing. I think if Boris had won again, there would have been a higher chance of winning the next election, but I think there would have been also a higher chance of them being completely wiped out. I think Sunak is damage control, I guess, of like, at this point he's probably thinking the next election is probably a write-off. Let's just see how much we can not lose by. Because I do think the next election, I think the polls will tighten, obviously, as they do around election time. And the Conservative Party will attempt to appear united again when 2024 rolls around. But I do think that there's maybe a 10% chance, 20% chance that the Tories win an election. Like, Rishi will have to do a lot of work, will have to be very charismatic, and I think he's not really that charismatic, you know. I think that was one of the, you know, one of the only selling points of Johnson was that he could be charismatic, kind of thing. Whereas I think Rishi doesn't have the ability to, like, inspire people. So I do think that it's more, at this point, damage control, try not to get completely wiped out. Because some of the polls, according to stuff like electoral calculus and stuff like that, had the Tories winning like 4 seats.
Yeah.
Which is like, would be completely absurd, you know.
Was your seat one of them, James, that would remain?
I actually think it might have been fair, thankfully.
I actually think it was, actually, thinking back to that data, yeah.
But I do think that at this point it's a try and get, you know, 250 seats, try to avoid 1997 again, where the Tories were down to, like, I can't remember how many it was.
It's 100 and 160 something, I think. It was their worst ever election in their very long history, as they are the oldest political party in the world that some of our listeners might not know.
Yeah.
Do you agree with James, Luke?
Although I think we are probably talking about the scale of the defeat rather than whether or not it's a defeat. 2 years is a long time in politics. If we think to how much has happened since December 2019, when it was Corbyn and Boris, we could see not only the political landscape but the global landscape is very different now to then. So, although what we know now suggests that the Tories are going to lose and Labour is probably going to have a very significant majority, things could happen in the next 2 years which are completely beyond what we can predict now. But if things remain roughly as they are now, I think the spectrum of results goes from a 1997 style, you know, a catastrophic defeat for the Conservatives, up to probably a Labour minority government as the worst case outcome if you're Keir Starmer. Potentially a confidence and supply agreement with the SNP or the Lib Dems, for example. That would be obviously what Sunak is aiming for and probably what Conservative Party strategists are looking for. I don't think anybody in the Conservative Party should be looking at a repeat of 2019 and a solid majority. Even a repeat of 2015 would be extraordinary under the current government. Especially after 12 years as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it would be unprecedented for a party to win a 5th consecutive term. That's never happened before. So it would be unprecedented. It is sort of Labour's to lose now. But as you say, things have really changed. I mean, it was sort of only this time last year the Conservatives started to poll lower than Labour, and that was only marginally, which was with the Owen Paterson scandal. It wasn't that long ago, about 18 months ago, that the Conservative Party were about 20 points ahead of the Labour Party. So things have really changed dramatically, and I think that the next election is going to be very difficult for the Conservative Party because Rishi Sunak will try and appeal to the red wall and the blue wall, and you see, the thing is, if he says, I'm going to be economically centre-right to please the blue wall voters that might think the government's gone a little bit too high with taxes, but then say I'm going to keep the cultural conservative views on immigration to appease the red wall voters, then also additionally, of course, that's going to put off the blue wall voters, the Rwanda policy, for example, and the red wall voters are going to be put off by, it looks like there could be another age of austerity under our Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. Jacob, do you think the Tories can turn this around? I mean, let's not underestimate the Conservative Party. They are the most successful political party in the world. However, divided parties don't win elections, and the Labour Party are polling at record highs.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is going to depend on how well Labour do in kind of creating a viable alternative to the Tories, because obviously at the moment, the Tory party is in a bit of was in a bit of a shambles. It's not looking great for them. However, I feel like Labour under Starmer is just not really offering something that voters can really identify with, because I think a large part of that is just that Starmer is not really very charismatic. He's not really the kind of leader that people can like Boris, that people can actually identify with and get behind and admire in that way.
It is interesting, really, the sort of level of popularity Boris Johnson still has in certain corners of the electorate. I mean, I won't underestimate that his popularity decreased massively as a result of Partygate, but there are still some corners of the country that do really like him, and I don't think there is any politician quite like him in that way that can survive such political turmoil, and the fact that it was even a possibility that he could come back and win an election is very unprecedented, really. Another unprecedented event. I mean, Luke, you mentioned that the best case scenario for the Conservative Party would be perhaps a Labour minority administration. But actually, would it be a best case scenario? Because a Labour Lib Dem coalition might result in electoral reform, which could keep the Conservative Party out for decades, if not forever. I mean, obviously I wouldn't say that for certain, because things will just change again, and the electorate will probably suddenly become very conservative for unexpected reasons. But do you actually think that the Conservative Party might prefer a Labour victory? In fact, as James did say, and this is an interesting point, there are a lot of Conservative MPs in the centre wing of the party that want to lose the next election, because they think it's the only way the Conservative Party will get back on what they want the party to go on, the track and direction that they want to go on. Do you think that electoral reform is something the Conservative Party should be wary of?
I think they should be wary of it. I do think they would continue to exist as a party under whatever new system succeeded first past the post, because there's always going to be a market for those kinds of policies. I think they would shift further towards the centre in a more proportional voting system, because there would be less pressure towards radicalism. I do think the prospects of electoral reform are still not particularly good, even if we did see a Labour minority government or a Labour Lib Dem coalition, because as we saw as recently as 2011, the Lib Dems were promised a vote on alternative vote, which is not quite proportional representation, but closer to it, and they got their referendum and they lost it. The Conservatives fulfilled their obligation as part of the coalition agreement and then undermined the alternative vote referendum more or less immediately. And we might see that kind of thing happen again under a Labour government. There's no Labour government would ever want to put itself out of power by changing the electoral system to undermine it. So even in a coalition with the Lib Dems, we would see perhaps a rerun of the AV episode of 2011. So if you're looking at it from a Conservative Party perspective, no, a Labour minority government is not a good thing for a Conservative MP. It may be better for the party in the long run because it would, as you say, give them time to kind of recompose themselves and perhaps attract the centre of the party that has been pushed away by the Johnson years. There are certainly benefits to being in opposition, as we've seen with Labour over the last 3 years. They seem to have come together under Starmer in a way that they never came together under Corbyn, and perhaps that is just the effect of being in opposition for so long and the desperation that can set in after 12 years out of power. So altogether, yes, I think. Although electoral reform is more likely, it's still not a desirable outcome for the Conservatives to hope for any election in which they're not in power.
Very interesting, very interesting. Of course, as you say there, electoral reform for Labour would not necessarily be a benefit either, because although they are more united now than they have been in recent years, they are also a coalition of many different persuasions, and I don't know in proportional representation whether or not the Corbynite and the Blairite wing would be able to continue to serve in the same party. We're going to take a musical break, not necessarily a musical song, but we're going to take a music break. Jess has asked a question. I just want you to ponder on this in the break, if you don't mind, panellists, and just so we can have a brief answer before we move on to our second topic, which is, are there any candidates currently in the Conservative Party who, after all the troubles they are having, looks likely to become the next leader after Sunak, if we expect Sunak to resign? So have a little think about that. But before then, and before our second topic, which is when we look over to the USA, it's time for a song, and Sunak and the boys are back in town.
On campus
and online.
This
is URN.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. We're live on University Radio Nottingham. I'd like to apologise for the technical difficulty we had with our last song there. The system just froze, but that's the beauty of live radio. Well, we asked a question to the panel. I asked a question to the panel before the break on who they thought would be the next leader after Rishi Sunak. So, Jacob, why don't you go first? Who do you think it's going to be?
Boris.
Luke, do you agree with that?
Someone from the centre of the party, probably not someone we know very well at this point. It will probably be a young person, probably a Kemi Badenoch type person, but not quite so strongly associated with the right.
And James?
I think Boris as well, to be honest. I think by that point he'll have gathered enough MPs around him, enough MPs will have forgotten about the woes of Partygate and such, and just think, he won in 2019, we're in dire need of him, and I think that's what he thinks as well, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sure he can pull something off, and he's done it before, so...
Teflon Boris. Okay, our second topic. We are moving over to the USA as our song has prepared us. Donald Trump has been requested to testify to Congress for the January 6th committee. January 6th committee? What's that? Says some of our audience members. Well, that is a committee investigating the Capitol riots. If you remember that in 2021, when a group of so-called patriots, as they call themselves, didn't recognise the result of the election, and they stormed the Capitol. What they wanted to hang Mike Pence, who was Donald Trump's vice president, who believed that Joe Biden won the election as he did. There is no evidence backing Trump and his supporters' claims. And they wanted to also, it's believed, they were planning on committing violent acts against Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker, and a very high up a Democrat politician who actually her house was broken into recently and her husband assaulted only, I think, yesterday. So it's very heightened times. Trump has refused to acknowledge the fact that he lost the 2020 election, and he is. It does seem likely, based on what he and his supporters are saying, that he does plan to run against Joe Biden in 2024. Recently, of course, Steve Bannon, who was a Trump ally, Trump has insulted him many times, but Bannon seems to still be on Trump's side, has been sent to prison for the fact that he did not turn up to this said committee. So what do we make of this about Trump being called to this committee? Do you think this is all of just sort of a democratic show trial to try and oust a popular president? Or do you think that it is one of the most dangerous times in US history, that a president has refused to acknowledge the result of an election, that subsequently some would say that he encouraged insurrection in his own country. What do you think of this? I'm going to start with you, Jacob, this time, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think the fact that this committee is definitely a good thing, because we need to be able to hold politicians accountable for their actions, and part of the idea of the rule of law is that no one is above the law, not even the president. And I think the fact that Trump has been summoned to give evidence is definitely a good thing, because I hope that it will force him to explain himself.
Luke, what do you think?
I think we're in the middle of a tremendous corrosion of the axioms of American democracy here. I mean, it all obviously starts with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, which, as we will remember, he didn't win the popular vote. And although Hillary Clinton conceded, as she should, that marks the second time in 16 years that the American president did not win the popular vote, which up till that point was fairly rare. And we're now seeing the consequences of what is essentially a breakdown of normal political function in the US. And although the January 6th committee is the right thing to do, and it represents the kind of the institutional backlash against Donald Trump, I don't think it will be effective in restraining the current of anti-democratic feeling in the US at the moment, because it's ran completely away from the ability of those in power to control it. I mean, the whole QAnon phenomenon, where even elected politicians are now endorsing conspiracy theories as a matter of course, and doing so to defend themselves against primary challengers who are even more extremist than them. I mean, you just see a tremendous breakdown of political norms, which those in power, including Joe Biden and his administration, are just not capable of dealing with, it seems.
James, would you echo that?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. It is a real erosion of American democracy, which is a real worrying thing to watch. I mean, again, and I think things like an increase of political violence is likely. I think we, like you talked about, literally just yesterday, Pelosi's home being broken into and her husband attacked. I think as we get closer to the next election, I think that will increase even more. And I think the committee, like Jacob said, I think the committee is a good thing, because I think it is important to hold politicians to account for what they've done, and it gets a lot of views, it informs a lot of people, I think, because a lot of the hearings are televised, and those get a lot of viewers, which I think is a good thing. It's good to inform people, not only to hold politicians account, but to show that you're doing it. However, at the same time, the Trump fans aren't going to be convinced by it, I think the problem is something like the January 6th committee is sort of only, I'm wary to say, just polarizing things further, but the Trump fans will ignore it and say, and echo what Trump says, that it is, like you said, a Democratic conspiracy to get rid of a popular president. It is mainly Democrats on the committee, even though Liz Cheney's on there. Liz Cheney is
an anti-Trump Republican, isn't she?
A rhino, I believe they call them.
Yes. James, do you want to define what a rhino is for the listeners that might not know?
Well, it stands for, I believe, Republican in name only, and it sort of became a term used by the Trump fans for basically anyone who opposed Trump. And the problem is, those sort of Republicans who oppose Trump are sort of being pushed aside. Liz Cheney lost, I believe at least, her primary. That's right, to a challenger who was a Trump candidate, so to speak. So I do think that the Republican Party in general is still stuck on this Trump phase. I don't think the January 6th committee will do anything to change that. I don't know what can be done, really, because I do think Trump will run again in 2024. I don't think they can stop that. I think even if the committee tries to get something on him, Trump's never going to prison. Let's be honest here, that's never happening. There's never going to be a criminal charge to make sure he doesn't run, because again, that would just incite further issues. I do think he'll lose again in 2024 and will refuse to accept that he lost again. And I do fear that the way things are going, we could just see a repeat of January 6th again. And I don't think the committee is doing much to change that, really. You know, you still have the diehard Trump fanatics, you know, who are clinging to every word he says. You know,
this is the thing, isn't it? You were hinting at this, James, and so were you, Luke and Jacob, about the polarization of the USA. That this isn't really, if you're a floating American voter, of which there aren't that many compared to this country, where there are a lot of people that will go from one party to the next per election. There isn't going to be a lot. There's not going to be a lot of. In terms of who's going to vote for who, this isn't going to make a lot of difference. There is, I believe, to use some political jargon, I believe that the USA is a centrifugal system where you have two very polarised camps, rather than the centripetal system that we would have, where most people are somewhere in the centre and basically want the same outcome. It's just they might disagree on who's best to deliver that. Whilst in the USA, looking at opinion polls, if you poll Democrat voters and Republican voters, they fear the other side. They fear them getting in, and they think that they stand against their values. And this is a situation, particularly when, if Trump and his supporters peddle conspiracy theories that there's some sort of deep state movement against him, and that he did really win the election, and yet again, if they lose 2024, it will make it appear that the state has acted against Trump and democracy again. A couple of things I want to bring up. Someone has messaged, how do American politicians close the massive divide that we've just been discussing about between the two major parties? Well, we see a moderate Republican candidate run in 2024. Do you think that? That's one question I'm going to ask you. There's also the possibility of Robert DeSantis running against Trump, because he's probably the most popular candidate in the Republican Party, though he is a Trump. He is on the... that's the most popular Republican candidate that isn't Trump, but he is on the Trump wing of the party. But the other point that I want to make, so they've got this, do you think there might be a third party that might run? But the other point that I want to make is if you are the Republican Party and you're a Trump supporter and you want Trump to win the next election, which, by the way, looking at opinion polls, is possible that he would win the next election, wouldn't it not be better if you were a Republican to accept that you lost? Because if there were voters out there that thought that there's no point voting because it's all going to be rigged anyway, then they might not actually turn up and vote, and the Democrats will win. So, what do you think about those 2 points? James, do you want to start us off?
Well, I think there's a lot of points there. On the third party, will a third party emerge? No, I think, flat out. I think systems like the American political system are created, it feels like, especially to sort of, or they naturally form a two-party system. We have a similar thing here, but less so, because, you know, the Lib Dems do exist, even though many people forget quite often. I don't think a third party is likely. How do you solve the divide? To be honest, like I said, I sound very doom and gloom here, but I don't really know. I think that the Trump camp is just going to continue to polarize, like, to keep moving further and further right. You know, again, as Luke said, there are literally candidates now trying to, like, out-conspiracy theory the other kind of thing. I don't think that a moderate Republican can come out and suddenly win, because it's... I don't know, they wouldn't get the support kind of thing of enough of the Republican Party to become the candidate, you know. If Trump runs, I think he's automatically got the nomination, you know. Or Trump or DeSantis. I don't think that there's any... I think not only is there not really a moderate candidate who, like, is very presentable, you know, who is very popular right now, you know, there's not really a moderate Republican in waiting, you know, who could even make a move like that, you know. I think even if there was one, the party is not going in that direction, and I think will not go in that direction for a while, kind of thing. Which, again, is very doom and gloomy, that I don't think there's a way to solve this divide, but I don't know. Maybe the rest of the panel might have a better idea.
Luke, do you have a solution to our problems?
Well, a few points. On the question of a third party, will a third party win the election? Absolutely not. Will a third party affect the election? Quite possibly, yes. We've seen a couple of times in American history where a third party acts as a spoiler on one of the two parties and ensures the victory of the other side. Famously, in 1992, an American businessman called Ross Perot ran alongside George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton and secured Bill Clinton's victory in that election. And perhaps most relevant to us today, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt rebelled from the Republican Party and ran on his own as the bull moose candidate against both the Republicans and the Democrats, and in essence secured the defeat of the Republican Party, led by Taft, by siphoning off a portion of the Republican votes. We could see that happen in 2024, certainly, if the Republican Party chose a figure who isn't Donald Trump, which could be DeSantis, or it could be a more moderate figure like Romney. Anyone who isn't Trump could cause Trump to run himself independently as a third party and split the Republican vote, which would almost guarantee a Democratic victory. I don't know if that's necessarily likely. I think the people around Trump have generally been fairly good at restraining his most destructive impulses, and that would certainly be a destructive impulse from a Republican perspective. But it certainly could happen, and I wouldn't rule it out. On the broader point about polarization, it is worth remembering that there are a very large number of Americans who are moderates and who don't have particularly extremist principles. But the information landscape in the US at the moment has become so incredibly polarized that it's very difficult for those moderate voters who are not particularly politically engaged to identify with moderate candidates. If they watch Fox News, or if they have friends who watch Fox News or are more politically engaged than them, they're likely to now pick up these talking points that have become more and more extreme over the last 4-6 years or so. And so that makes it increasingly difficult to make a moderate choice. You see Joe Biden and the Democrats trying very hard to put forward a fairly standard political message, which of course did secure them the win. But it's not something that cuts through to the average apolitical voter very well, whereas the conspiracy theories, the QAnon, the deep state, all of the things that are rolling around on the right side of the political landscape at the moment cut through to the public because they're so extreme and because they're so divergent from the norm. They become talking points. I mean, we're talking about them right now. It's very difficult to be a reasonable, moderate candidate when your opponent is going further and further off the deep end.
Jacob?
So I think in order for a third party to be viable, obviously you need to have the support base among the general public for that. And obviously if, as has been said, people are becoming more and more polarised in America, and even those moderates that do exist are just becoming more drawn towards what seems like generally Republican and quite extreme Republican at that rhetoric. I just don't think that a third party would be able to get enough support from the general public to really affect any meaningful change.
Very interesting, very interesting. We're going to take another musical break. Thank you very much for that. And there will be the midterms, of course, coming up in November in America. It will be interesting to see what happens there, and we will certainly be talking about that. So our next song has got nothing to do with what we've just discussed, but I'm a big Take That fan, so enjoy Greatest Day.
We're on campus and we're online.
University
Radio Nottingham.
Hello and welcome back to The Big Picture. We're live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes. Our third topic is the elections in Brazil. So Brazil is going to enter its second round of elections tomorrow. It had its first round earlier this month, I believe. It might have been late last month. And the two leading candidates are the current sitting president, who is called Bolsonaro, and a former president that some of our older listeners might remember, who I'm going to simply refer to as Lula, because his name is very long and in Portuguese, and I don't want to butcher it for your lovely ears back home. So it was believed originally that Lula was going to win a landslide victory. But in the first round, Bolsonaro, although he did come second to Lula, didn't lose by as much as people were predicting. And it looks like now the polls have tightened, as they often do in elections, and it looks to be very tight, but Lula is ahead. Now, both these candidates are a little bit controversial, I might say. So, Bolsonaro has been in trouble in the past for saying things that we in the West would deem to be misogynistic or homophobic. And, of course, let us not forget when the Amazon was burning and Macron offered assistance, free assistance to help the Amazon, Bolsonaro insulted his wife. So he's quite the character. He also is a bit Trump-like and doesn't necessarily accept democratic results. But Lula, the other candidate, the left-wing candidate, he has just come out of prison for corruption charges. He was paid the equivalent in US dollars of 1.3 million for votes. That was perhaps another scandal. There was lots and lots of corruption scandals of people paying members of his party to back them in the vote. To vote the way of which these lobby groups and external parties wanted them to support. The election has been quite nasty. There have been accusations that Lula is a Satanist in a very heavily religious country, and accusations that Bolsonaro is a cannibal. So very briefly, we don't have long left on this show, sadly, today, but what do we think is going to happen? Who do you think is going to win? And what does this say about the state of democracy in quite a large democratic state of Brazil? That the two leading candidates are both rather controversial figures. Do you want to start, Luke?
Yeah, it's quite remarkable, actually, how close the election is. I was following this and seeing what seemed to be an expected win for Lula, and now they've tightened to such a point that I think, according to The Economist, it's now 52% to 48% against Bolsonaro, which is a figure that we here in Britain remember with either great fondness or great sadness, I'm sure. So I think regardless of what happens and regardless of how it turns out, we will see widespread allegations of election fraud, and a similar situation to the US in 2020, possibly from either side, though I think Bolsonaro is more likely to cry foul if he loses than Lula.
Jacob?
Yeah, I think regardless of what happens, I think we will see Brazil going in... I was going to say going in a similar direction to America, but actually, on second thought, I think it might be the other way around, that, Brazil is essentially what America will become if they don't get their act together and protect the stability of their political institutions a bit more.
That's a very interesting point about democracy itself. How safe is it, James?
Well, I'd say about a month ago, I was more worried that Lula was very obviously going to win, and Bolsonaro has made a lot of claims that if he loses, then he didn't really lose, it was rigged. And he has the army behind him. Bolsonaro is a big army guy. He supported the military dictatorship in Brazil in the past. There were big fears that if Lula won, then Bolsonaro would pull a Trump and refuse to quit, and he'd have the military behind him. Whereas now, I am genuinely pretty sure that Bolsonaro's going to win. I think the polls are so close to the point where it could go either way, and I think it does generally favour candidates like Bolsonaro. Again, Bolsonaro I don't think was polling to win in his first election. Trump was polling to lose in 2016 and sort of surprised everyone and won. Bolsonaro polled better than people thought he would in the first round. I think at this point the likely answer is Bolsonaro wins again, which is very damaging to Brazil's democracy, to Brazil in general. Bit of a bad state of affairs overall, would say.
That's very interesting you think that, James. Very interesting. Well, we'll see. The election is tomorrow. Thank you very much, James, Luke and Jacob, for being on The Big Picture today. And thank you to our regular listeners from Beeston, Lucy, Ollie, James and Amy, and George Scotland's aunt, of course, and Ella and Gemma, who are listening today, and Jess and Dave from Cornwall. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week at 5 o'clock on University Radio Nottingham. Amy requested a song by Michael Jackson that I can't find in our system, but this is another song by Michael Jackson that does link to the Halloween, which of course is on Monday, and a happy birthday to Ollie on Monday as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening. I've been Felix Hawes. Goodbye.